All right. Welcome everybody to the City Council Legislative Subcommittee meeting for Monday, April 13th. I guess we'll take the roll. Yeah.
Sure. Mayor McHenry,
Here.
Councilor Cook, here. Councilor Flynn, here. And we also have Chairperson Rappaport from the school board.
Excellent. So first up is the approval of minutes for March 16th, 2026.
Move to approve the minutes from March 16, 2026.
I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Jane.
Yes, so obviously we're watching the risk pool bills. The three of them, 1605 was killed. 1491 is the one that we supported as a city. However, there was a recent amendment to 1491 that, according to my conversation with the folks at Health Trust, would make it financially very difficult for their entity to continue. It wasn't as extreme as the 661 bill that we had opposed, but it still had some issues relative to various financial criteria for the entity that would have been very challenging to meet. So there was a hearing on 1491 last week and also the amendment to 1491. It has not come out of committee yet with any sort of recommendation. My understanding from my communication with Senator Perkins Quokka is that there may be yet another amendment to 1491 to get it closer to something that's more workable for the two types of risk pools. And her office is reaching out to, I'm trying to hold on a minute, another senator was spearheading this. Just a second. Senator Rosenwald. So I'll hear from, we've been in constant communication with Senator Perkins Quokka's office about all of these risk pool bills, and they're very good about looping us in. The other issue is 661. That is the one that we had opposed. Oh, I'm going to back up for a minute. For 1491, we sent the mayor's school care op-ed. The senator's office thought that would be a good way of, educating the committee about how the past model was problematic. And so, interestingly, tomorrow at 1:15, there is a hearing on 661, the one we oppose. And I was thinking we could do the same thing, Mayor. We could forward your school care op-ed
Sure.
to 661 when we register in opposition for tomorrow. By the nodding head.
Is it House Bill 661 or is that the Senate Bill 661?
I believe, hold on. Senate bill. I think it's Senate bill. Hold on a minute.
Okay, it just says House Bill on it, but okay, that's
Okay,
fine.
661. It's Senate bill, excuse me, my mistake.
Okay.
Senate bill 661. However, it's in the House. The hearing is crossed over into the House. So those are the big ones we've been doing a lot of work on. And I know for open enrollment and education funding, there's been a lot going on. So one of the things that's important to know is Senate Bill 101 is the school choice bill. That there's going to be a work session, an executive session this week. I think it's midweek for that bill. And so there's been a recent amendment to that bill. I think Lisa's nodding her head, that is require municipalities to get sort of a formal process somehow for this enrollment process. There's some suggestion of not using property taxes, but the state dollars for the open enrollment, which I don't know if that is simply an assignment of the adequacy amount from one town, from the sending town to the receiving town. I have not seen that amendment, and I think they're still working on that. regardless, there are still huge questions of transportation and special ed and how that's gonna work between communities. So we'll find out through the work session, and there'll be an executive session after that, where this goes. And then after that, I'll go to the full house, and that won't be till next week. So that's something that everyone is very much concerned about. The other bill, that there's a special ed bill that is very much could have a fiscal impact on municipalities, and that's House Bill 1563. There's a hearing today on that. Like a lot of bills, it has good things and bad things in it. It caps the special ed amount per child. I think the positive is there is some processes that are in the bill that aren't there now. The negative is, where will the extra money come from, right? Is it gonna shift costs on the local taxpayer above and beyond that cap? The other thing that's interesting is, before you can get your state aid, you have to apply for through private insurance and Medicaid and that sort of thing. And I think the concern with this bill is that administrative oversight is tough. I think it adds an extra layer. So that is another one that could have a fiscal impact.
So, do you know the cap in it is a cap on state aid, not a cap overall on special ed for that child?
You can look at it. I'm sorry, it's a late ad. Do you know 1563?
I would say it is unclear. There is a cap of 50,000 per pupil instead of the current formula that's 3.5 times the state average. And then there's also, I think, a total reimbursement cap of 160,000 per student, which I think people are a little unclear right now of whether that's sort of a lifetime, all the way through their education experience.
Right.
That's not a lot of money if you're talking about K-12. It's a better number if you're talking about, 1 year. And the language is unclear. I think, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And then,
And I think the issue is right now, they already seek Medicaid funding, but the bill would potentially deduct up front what they think Medicaid is
and
going
then
to
you
give
get that
them, and then you have to
subtracted
sit
from
even
what
longer
was
and wait for the money if they decide to give it to you.
yeah, so those could have, major impacts on, on anybody's budget in any municipality. So those are very important to watch. The other one is House Bill 751. Lisa, that's the other bill. Have you been able to track that? Well, there's another open enrollment bill it's that, and I believe that's in the Committee of Conference now, right?
It's been there for quite a while.
Yeah, so I don't know where that stands, but they're negotiating over the amendments, and we'll see what happens. So this is a real thing that we are watching, and we'll continue to watch. And I think now that leaves the Mayor's Roundtable.
So that got rescheduled for today.
Oh, okay, great. And then really the purpose.
Are there any things that you'd like to discuss there?
Yeah, any issues for the mayors overall that may be, education stuff, as we know, because we have different constituencies for the mayors and the different cities they represent. But yeah, if there's any other bills.
Or if you think about it after you leave, just send me an email.
I think these were the bills I was following, the education bills are the ones I was following most closely, because the financial impact is pretty
Pretty
significant.
big, yeah.
I have a question for that. Year after year, do you reintroduce or repropose legislation like the hotel occupancy to kind of hammer that?
Yeah, it's there's a couple of rocks we push up the hill. That's one of them, for sure. Let's see. I can't really recall other legislation that, and there'll be like various forms of the legislation that kind of comes back. One, it's like, there was one where it was tied to tourism that had the chambers that were, you know, more focused on, you know, delivering that. Last year, it made it a little bit reasonable in that it was going to tie it to first responders. That seemed to do well.
What was that? I'm sorry. Was
Tying it to first responders with the idea that tourism and hotels specifically require a larger share of fire and police than would otherwise support a community of 23,000.
Yeah.
So tying that seemed to do well. There's some other you know, evergreen things that we'll sign on to, like the return to the retirement funding, where there was a one-time expansion of that, or funding of that at 7%, and that the state zone law says what 30% is what it was, but they don't ever get back to that. So there's a couple of ones that we will either introduce or support, and by us introducing, I mean, it takes somebody up there to introduce it. We just speak out on behalf. But things that kind of return money to the state, or advocating for room and meals, you know, going back to the 40% that's owed by the state, up from the 30% on the funding formula. They did increase it from 20%, which it was, what, 7 years ago? Somewhere in there, to 30%, but did that also while cutting the room and meals tax more from, it used to be 9 and now it's 8.5. Or is it 9 and it's now 7.5? I can't
There
remember.
was another cut, I think they were hoping to cut it again this year.
Yeah, but there are ones that that make it up there, but you could put it in the broad bucket of allowing money to stay within the city of Portsmouth and not go. You know, we advocated for, I think there was always worth reminding people that we don't get any of the speeding ticket revenue here.
Right.
So that all stays, that's sent to the state. And so there was a bill that was going to change that, but that also failed. The problem is that they don't have any money up there, and so every chance there is to keep it, they do.
I think the big bills this week, besides 101, which is, you know, open enrollment, is the campus carry bill, and concerns around the cuts to potential additional business tax cuts.
Yeah. That one, that's 700 something, I forget that one.
Yeah. So,
Also the constitutional amendment for,
Yeah.
That's the other one that's getting a lot of press, is CACR 12.
Yeah.
Which has passed the Senate. It's in the House Ways and Means. There was a non-germane amendment, and it's basically prohibiting an income tax, so.
Are they going to have the hearing on it?
Do you have it up?
yes, that's my understanding. I'm looking to see what date it is. Wednesday, the 15th, 3 p.m.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
And again, that's an important one to track. You know, all these ones that have such huge fiscal impacts.
What happens with the constitutional amendment?
Then it has to come
go
back and then
on the
people
ballot?
have to vote, yeah. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's always my concern, is all these, the cuts mean that there are cuts to local reimbursement for things. And so I'm kind of tracking that, because I was looking at the highway funds, the state's highway funds, and we're down to 14 million or something that was dispersed down in 10 years from 40 million to 14 million. So they're actually reducing the amount of highway funds they're dispersing, which explains why the Rotary traffic circle was taken off their schedule. All of those cuts mean cuts to things like Lafayette Road, Route 1, ever being redone.
Yeah, It's really a tough time. And, you know, we talked last time about the one-time forgiveness for the tax. That's not gonna come next year either. So I think we're just gonna see further tightening of belts. And then the other ed funding bill, and this is being tracked by CC2, the definition of adequacy, that passed, which I believe substantially narrows what the state's obligation is, because it narrows the definition of the adequacy education. So we're watching that as well, which leads, you know, all the other bills for changes in the funding formula, probably not gonna happen, no matter where they are in the queue. A couple of other bills, the 1010, House Bill 1010, we were watching that. That was the residential development on commercially zoned land. That's the last one standing on that.
Oh, yeah.
There's no hearing date. It's in Senate Commerce. So, but that's the one we will register in opposition to that one. That state housing champion designation bill, grant program, that passed the House, but it's been stuck in the Senate Commerce since February 17th. I believe they have very strong sponsors for that, one of which is Senator Perkins Coker, and sometimes they just don't take action, you know. So I don't know why it's taken, you know, almost a month and it's not out of committee. So when that happens, you wonder if they're just politely gonna, you know, just let it go. The eligibility for local assistance, House Bill 348, that was that residency requirement one we talked a long time ago.
Do we just want to go through the request for legislative policies before we get to
Sure,
the other
sure.
bills?
All right, so let's regroup. Legislative policies. So here's the form. I emailed NHMA and said, we have a city council meeting on the 20th, so I see these are due the 17th. If this committee was to pass a couple and get it on the agenda for the 20th, I said, can we send it the 21st? And I haven't heard back, but I'd be surprised if they said no. There were two issues I think that you raised, Mayor, last time. One was a carve out for the opposition to statewide zoning amendments if it had no fiscal impact. Before we get started, I just want to point out three things in the legislative principles, just so we know what we would be dealing with. Number 3 on their broad principles that guide all of their legislation is to advocate, to maintain and enhance existing local authority in all areas of local government. And so again, that's, I think, the principle for opposing statewide amendments to zoning ordinance generally. And then the other things that, just to note for our discussion on the upper right-hand corner of this page 7, it opposes legislation that detracts from existing local authority, right there.
Right.
And then the other principle that we should be mindful of in these discussions on this and the homestead, potential discussion of homestead, is on page 9 on the top here, right here. They have supported a study commission for local enabling legislation to allow for a uniform homestead exemption for resident owners on a principal place of residence. So I think if you're going to look at the homestead issue, that might be the one you might want to suggest an amendment to. And the last one of note regarding the potential edits would be on page 13. And it is right here, legislation that erodes local control over land use decisions. So I just flagged those real quick because I think we had talked generally about homestead and generally about carving out some exception to opposing statewide legislation if it doesn't have a negative fiscal impact. I think was particularly about housing there. And so
Yeah, I don't think that's probably gonna we'd have to cut that into places.
Right.
Happy to hear the discussion, but I don't think we would have to. I don't think that I don't think it's likely to have any legs. I mean, through the NHMA, I mean, maybe
Yeah.
there's a League of Cities that could
That's
exist,
an idea, certainly,
but
right. Yeah.
outside of NHMA, but I don't think that NHMA is going to be supportive of things that would shift any of the burden of building housing away from cities and onto towns.
All right, well, that clears that up.
I think so.
It's really unfortunate, but we're outnumbered.
Yeah, I think that's true, but Mayor, I think that's an excellent idea for your mayor's group, because the cities take the burden of, the housing,
Yeah.
for not only its residents, but neighboring smaller towns that aren't really addressing the issue, so I think that's a great discussion to have for your mayor's group or your League of Cities, not League of Mayors.
Yeah, I think the League of Cities where
Yeah.
we could appoint somebody or maybe even do something that's similar to if we move away from funding a coalition communities, as it no longer likely has much left to do on the court side, to look at diverting some of those funds to an advocate within Concord that could advocate on issues that are aligned to cities more broadly. Concord, Manchester,
Mhm.
Nashville.
Very, very interesting. Look forward to hear more about it.
On the household exemption, the general support, I think that we want to be really careful that they support a homestead exemption that doesn't negatively impact any of their membership. So we don't want a homestead exemption that lowers essentially property tax values across the state, and then the equalized property tax values impact us negatively in funding Rockingham County, or because we already pay the highest rate to Rockingham County. We are gonna end up having, because we have a lot of people with vacation homes here, we are gonna end up, our property tax value will actually probably become even higher with a homestead exemption. If the homestead exemption is counted towards property tax valuation when considering our contributions to Rockingham County.
So would they change it? Like, so what I would imagine like the homeowner's exemption that existed in 1972 was on the basis of a local option. So every community could opt in for the purposes of their own taxing. So they would still be in terms of the community tax, I don't know if that would be affected. Like, I think that would simply that would continue, and it would pass on. It would just be how we're collecting those taxes would be similar to what we do with a senior and disabled tax exemption.
Which would be great, and I'm fine with that. I want to make sure, there were a few bills that were kind of questionable
Oh,
on this.
right.
They were about
Yeah, it was hard to figure it out.
kind of
Yeah.
about transferring
Yeah.
taxation to wealthier communities
Right.
by providing homestead
Mhm.
relief for,
Right, some of the early education funds too. There was
yeah.
linked with some of the ed bills too. There was some of that as well.
Well, it's also linked with the rooms and meals. There was also an effort
Yes.
to shift.
Yes,
If you
that was
have
interesting.
certain high levels of property valuation, you don't get rooms and meals. So,
Which was thankfully defeated. So the current policy as written says, a study committee of local enabling legislation to allow for a uniform homestead exemption for resident owners on the principal place of residence. What if the suggested policy was simply to support local enabling legislation to allow rather than a study committee?
That's great.
Would
That's-
that, I
that's
mean,
great.
that's broad enough, it's not too specific, okay. So how about to support?
And can we throw in local option?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, to support local enabling legislation, that's the local, yep, local enabling legislation to allow for a uniform homestead exemption for resident owners on the principal place of residence. Okay, and do you wanna vote that as a
Oh, sure, wait,
suggestion
a
of-
motion as an amended to the New Hampshire Municipal Association's legislative priorities.
So moved.
Second?
Any discussion? Jane, as always, you crack it, right out of the park there. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So that will go on our council agenda for the 20th,
Yeah,
and we could even probably send it a waiting vote if
as
it's
a, yes, I certainly can do that today, and I bet I'll hear back from Margaret, whether she
Sure.
says the 21st is fine, so,
I'm sure she'll.
I'm
it's fine.
sure it will be fine. And, the rest of the policies are pretty, I haven't changed drastically over the several years we've been monitoring this. I don't know if anyone has a suggestion for another policy at this point to suggest to NHMA?
It's pretty broad. I mean, I think they do a relatively good job tackling the major issues. It's just challenging because there are issues that we have as a city that
Exactly.
where we're going to clash a little on some of these.
Exactly. Okay, and,
Track bills.
yeah, so we got through most of them already, the big ones. There's just a few more. The eligibility for local assistance, the House Bill 348, that is passed. I think that's waiting for the governor's signature. That's the one that has the residency requirement prescribed in a very detailed manner. According to our welfare director, because the requirement is documented evidence of leases and utility bills or registration, because any place that has a homeless shelter those folks are gonna have, from Manchester or Portsmouth, they'll have records that pertain to the city of Portsmouth. So if they move and they go somewhere else and they still have these records they have no other records of residency, before, the welfare folks worked really well together, and they still do. But this would be required, documentation. But I have confidence and the welfare directors of the state have been working really hard on amendments. They've been talking to one another, so I think there's a great understanding among those hardworking folks. But there were some amendments and to this, but I still think that it has a residency requirement that will perhaps reject folks who are leaving cities, and the smaller towns will reject them because of the lack of proof, because they'll still be having documentation that might establish residency in the major cities where there are shelters and things.
So
There is an emergency exception too. The welfare director could simply say, listen, notwithstanding these documents, you're eligible for assistance.
so I had a concern around this one specifically because Portsmouth has probably a lot of people who are unhoused who don't have those records in Portsmouth.
And that's the flip side of the problem, right?
Yeah,
When you
but-
have nothing.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of people that, are we just supposed to not provide any assistance to them?
And that's where the bill isn't, although the bill prescribes specific documentation, I think that's where the welfare directors are working with one another to capture those folks who might slip between the cracks. And what they do regarding that, whether, I'm calling the sending and receiving, I know that's education terms, but the sending town, they could say, hey, I lived in blah. I'm certain that the welfare directors, they always do this anyway. They call one another, they work it out between them. So my hope is that that's what's gonna happen, that there'll still be a means by which to quickly address, those folks who don't have that documentation.
There's some local control.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be tough because, a lot of people don't have anything. I mean, they literally have no documentation, so we'll see how broad the carve out for the emergency is, the emergency exception. And, you also have to establish rules and regulations per department, which I know we do already have rules, but I think they're going to have to be edited a bit. We talked about 751, the municipal liability, 1064, it passed the House and we registered an opposition. It's in state judiciary, it hasn't been scheduled for a hearing yet, we'll oppose that. The same with the trespass order on municipal property, it makes it much harder to issue those types of no trespass orders, that's 1184. It passed the House and it's in Senate election, no hearing yet on that. And then we have the zoning requirements for child daycare providers. That was the one of them we supported, passed the House, and it's in Senate election. Once again, no hearing yet. 1433 is that child care tax credit, which a lot of folks are watching. So it passed the House and Senate Ways and Means, and it is going to Senate Finance. So it's passing on through. So we'll see what Finance does with that one. We talked about all the risk pool and the school choice and open enrollments. Let's see. And then we mentioned the constitutional amendment, which is one I wanted to flag. And those were the highlights that I pulled from our list.
Do we think the task force to study housing at Pease is going to go through? It passed the Senate.
I think so, because it's a task force and it's a study. I think, and I think when it's phrased that way, it has a much, it didn't start out that way, I don't think. But I think that's pretty likely to move forward, because it's not just the school, I think that's asking, but it's also, the housing for the military, that's a question, and so I'd be surprised, but again, I don't have the inside story on that, but it's a study committee, so usually, that's something that's not too controversial.
Okay. So the last one I had a question on was the House Bill 1788, this prohibition of DEI in contracts.
Oh, that's a tough one. That is on the very last page.
Yeah.
And, that was something that came up on the list last time. That's very controversial. The reason that it's controversial is that, but the good news is that the Senate Judiciary referred it to interim study on the consent calendar.
Okay.
So that's I think that's the new development. Last meeting, that it hadn't been referred, it was still in the Senate committee. And what was scary about that was, if they contain DEI language, the contracts would be void, and also any citizen could bring suit. So not just someone affected by the terms of the contract or.
What is the DEI in a contract? Like if we
Lisa,
specifically.
you are well versed in this with the school.
I don't know the specific bill, but broadly it could be, it mentions,
Diversity, equity.
it could mention race, sex, sexual orientation, like any of the anti-discrimination protected categories, for the most part, they're mentioned in the contract in some way. I don't know why those would be in a contract, though. I mean, I know sometimes when you put an RFP out, you might say we're looking for a veteran-owned business, or we want to prioritize, women and minority-owned businesses.
Right.
I'm not
So
sure if
those
that's what
would
they're
be
trying to
sort of-
target.
Just like the federal grants and all those
All in,
prohibitions, they're all taken out. You had to take any reference to, and even environmental references had to be removed for federal grant.
for federal grants.
I mean, in medical research, they can't even say that they're doing a study on women right now and get a grant, even if it's a women's health study. So,
My concern is around contracts. How many contracts do we have EEOC language in? Just
Yeah, we've gone through, Jennifer Smith from our office has worked a lot with the school department on many contracts and many grants to look at that language and make sure we're complying with the federal requirements, particularly obviously when it's federal money. to make sure that our language complies.
Right, because there's federal requirements to have EOC language, and then if we have the state telling us we can't have language, are we going to have?
Well, this is on the consent calendar for interim study, so.
So we can hope.
So we can hope that it dies, and if that passes, and since it's the Senate consent calendar, it'll likely pass. Again, this is an issue that we can also watch, but there have been many statements from the federal government to the city relative to all of our grants and grant language that we can and cannot have. And some of the broader, I think, environmental, climate-related ones, you had to remove that, and DEI. Some of the DEI language also had to go, but we have been reviewing that since January.
It includes the ADA too, so that hopefully that forces people to flip the brakes a little bit, you know.
Okay.
Any other questions or bills that like Chuck, Lisa, anything that you want to raise to the attention of the Legislative Subcommittee?
We are waiting to see the outcome of the open enrollment hearings.
Okay.
It feels a bit murky still.
And has the school board come up with a policy yet on?
So Jane may have a better handle on this, but I believe that you and Zach connected, and the process for Portsmouth would be the school board would pass a recommendation to the council. We actually have a sample recommendation on our agenda for tomorrow night.
Okay.
And it's modeled on what some of the other larger cities have done that have a similar government structure, where we would basically make a recommendation to the council to admit some percentage of kids and let some percentage of kids leave. And then it would go to you to have the series of postings and public hearings. And I believe that you already worked out a calendar with the superintendent that was very rough.
We
It was
had,
a while
we had
ago,
a while
but I know
back,
you
we
two
had said,
discussed
this
the
is how, if you're
process.
gonna do it.
Right.
Yeah, we had set first, second, third, and told him what would be required, but I haven't seen a document yet.
And how many children request to leave the school district every year?
I do not know that. I don't think it's a very big number, and I mean, it hasn't changed that much over the last several years. I mean, there's a certain number that go to Heronfield for middle school. There's a certain number that go to St. Pat's. There's kind of standard places, and that's been fairly stable. In terms
Is
of
there,
requesting
like-
to go to another public school, that just hasn't really been a thing.
Right.
With
Yeah.
the exception of the Newcastle Elementary, which is a very unique situation, and there are occasionally people
Oh,
that want a tuition in there.
But this would allow us, it wouldn't apply to St. Pat's, right? Like we wouldn't be,
So, no.
or is it unclear?
This specific legislation, as drafted the last time I read it, which.
That's a private school, okay.
No, I mean, it's intended to facilitate students from one public school going to another public school in a different district, and then setting up some sort of structure around who would pay and how those funds would be allocated. I think that, I mean, I did go to the hearings. I wasn't able to testify because they, you
so
know,
many people.
they kind of ran down the clock a little bit as well, possibly, but that happens. What we're trying to do is cut through and come up with a process so that we have something ready to be responsive, because the concern is if it does go to the governor in some form that takes effect immediately, we don't want to be back on our heels over the summer without some plan. And since it would take a series of meetings for us to be ready to go, we're trying to take a first attempt to have something that would cover the broadest range of anticipated outcomes. The question right now is the original version of the bill was going to give a lot of flexibility to local districts to look at capacity. And one of the questions right now is whether the state is going to make it mandatory to both permit students leaving and permit students entering. And so there's some tussling right now over how much local control we'll have over the ability to set capacity. So if we look at our district objectively, we don't really have room in the elementary schools. We just went through redistricting. We can look at that any number of ways. There's not space. we're already trying to address some crowding issues. If we look at the middle school, you know, and then if we look at the high school, it's maybe a different conversation. But we also have an area agreement, and the legislation at this time has been pretty mute on that. But that's a legal contract that's been in place for decades, where we're giving priority to those residents. And we don't know yet what happens to that under,
Okay.
so, I don't know, that's a long-winded answer, but basically, we're gonna try to set some parameters for how we would decide capacity, and then send it to the council for consideration.
And are they gonna be above 0?
I believe so.
Okay.
We're trying to be cautious about it until we know what it looks like, because without knowing the financial parameters and who will reimburse and what we will get, it could become reckless really quickly to have large numbers of students moving in and out until you know how it's gonna work. So I think we're setting a somewhat low percentage in what we're recommending to you right now. That doesn't mean we couldn't revisit it down the line once we know more. But we wanted to try to have something on the books by the end of the school year, because we have to be able to plan
Sure.
enrollment based on what we think will be the number of students in the
Timing
building.
is everything, right? Because
Yes.
summer, yeah.
You know, so if we suddenly have to scramble in the summer with a flood of people moving in and out, and I don't think that's what would happen, but I don't know. I mean, so certainly we can continue to have that conversation, but that's our best guess right now.
Backing up a little bit, Mayor, how do you want the draft New Hampshire Municipal Association's policy to come forward on the agenda? Do you want it under your name or one of the committee members' names to bring forward?
One of the committee, if you, happy to have it under my name, if that's easier.
It doesn't matter, but
We'll have it under
Either
my
way.
okay. All right, I can do that real quick today, get that.
Okay. Well, appreciate the conversation. You know, I think there's on the open enrollment, I think try to look at it in the most positive light possible, you know, but it's going to have a definite impact on schools within the state. Now, I am not one to think it's going to have a super negative impact on Portsmouth, only because of the work that everybody has done to make our schools, you know, a very good place to get an education and for folks to want to come in. But I think the larger question is what will happen to schools across the state when people start coming out of those, and communities, you know, like what ends up occurring, and you know what they will lose as a part of those communities if there's not enough kids to maintain the educational quality or even pay the capital costs of those buildings. So
That is the broader concern.
so appreciate you guys working to balance those, you know, without kind of jumping in. You know, one of the things that I saw is some communities have said nobody leaves. You know, I think that's a conversation that ends up, you know, hurting us long term in an educational sense, because, you know, like we have to be always feeling as though we're going to be better and better and better, and the idea that nobody gets to leave, even though like I couldn't imagine there's an enormous amount of folks in Portsmouth that are looking to tuition out, or even, you know, if Portsmouth would pay to go drive over to Exeter, you know, if the opportunity exists here to get, you know, an education. So I think it's helpful that it's not 0, and appreciate, you know, that would be the recommendation, because I think that makes the argument that we're trying to be thoughtful of the entire state in terms of an economic or a educational framework, you know, all the better. But I was sad to see that kid that, you know, was rejected, you know, that was bullied. The state had mandated them to go, was it North or Seabrook to Northampton, Hampton Falls, and they had rejected, you know, that application. That seems like a pretty sad story, and one. I'm sure there's a lot more to it, you know, but the papers don't always get the gray there.
And one thing that did come up in the hearings, which I don't think is resolved, just in terms of the broader equity question, is there was a lot of concerns raised about the cost of special education, about the cost of helping students with behavioral issues and learning disabilities. And then one of the proposed fixes, well, then we'll let schools screen. And then you have a whole other equity issue of you can reject all the students that would be too expensive or difficult, and then it just, every time you pull a thread in one direction, there feels like there's some other unintended set of questions. So I think not 0 we can do, but we're trying to avoid getting too locked into, huge numbers of kids moving until we know the education impact, the financial impact, and the logistics. And there's no transportation provisions in this. So you're essentially enabling, families who have a parent with a car and the time and the resources to do this, to go if they choose to, and not providing that same option to a different student who maybe doesn't have that number of resources at home to facilitate it. So there's a lot of equity issues in every direction.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern about it is the equity piece. I think we'll start seeing varsity sports shopping. The students who are really good at sport, looking for the school where they think they're going to be most successful, and have the most opportunity. And so, whichever school has the best hockey program or the best baseball program, those students are going to start kind of self-filtering.
Yep.
And so that's my concern is that'll only enhance the sports at certain schools, and then it'll become less competitive statewide. I think that's always a challenge.
NHIAA has stayed out of this up until this point, but that has been an open question about whether they will then have to respond with some eligibility rules around this, where you might not be able to play the first year you move to try to stop that. But that is a conversation that's sort of not really played out, but people are asking.
Yeah.
Because it's a problem.
It's a problem, yeah.
Excellent. Well, anything else that is not on the agenda? We had a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second, yeah.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you, Jane.